Hello, I'm Jack Perkins. Welcome to Biography. Sometime on the night of July 16th, 1918, a chapter in Russian history came to a violent close. After 300 years in power, the Romanov imperial dynasty ended with the execution of Tsar Nicholas II by Bolshevik revolutionaries. The tragedy also was the heartbreaking end to a royal love story, for along with the Tsar, his devoted wife, the Empress Alexandra, and at least 3 of their 5 children were also brutally murdered that night. For nearly 75 years, the Soviet Union kept the details of the murders under lock and key, but with the lifting of the Iron Curtain, the true story of Nicholas and Alexandra, their lives and their deaths, has finally come to light. Nicholas and Alexandra, the last Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, came to power more than 100 years ago in 1894. Within 25 years, they and their family were dead, murdered by the Bolsheviks. The life and death of one of the world's most powerful dynasties has been shrouded in secrecy, confused by communist propaganda. Only now is it possible to put together the jigsaw of the Romanov tragedy, an imperial family bound by blood, love, and politics. Here is a moment in history unthinkable until recently. For the first time ever, a British sovereign sets foot on Russian soil. The violent execution of Nicholas and Alexandra in 1918 deeply affected Queen Elizabeth's grandfather, King George V, a cousin of the Tsar. They had close ties. Nicholas spent holidays in England with his English-speaking wife, Alexandra. Though born in Germany, Alexandra was one of Queen Victoria's favorite grandchildren and stayed with her frequently as a child. The Queen's cousin, His Royal Highness Prince Michael of Kent, is also closely related to both Tsar Nicholas and his wife, Alexandra.
I used to walk past this picture every day as a small child, and it fascinates me. It shows King George V, my grandfather, with the Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, with his son Alexei the Tsarevich. It's extraordinary to see how very similar the cousins were. Of course, we know that the Tsar and his family were assassinated in 1918. I've always felt somewhere very close to them, particularly because I have Romanov blood through my grandmother, who was herself a Grand Duchess. So I've always wanted to know more about the Tsar's family and what really happened to them.
In an archive in Moscow, every facet of the life of the Tsar and his family was secretly preserved by the communists. That archive is now open. The murder of Nicholas and Alexandra brought to an end a love affair that had lasted all their lives.
The archive contains an astonishing number of letters between the Tsar and Tsarina. They wrote to each other every day that they were apart for a period of about 20 years. And all the letters were numbered. This one was written by the Tsar to her, and the writing paper is headed Novy Imperatorski Poyezd, which means the new imperial train. And it's number 128.
My darling, beloved, sweet wifey. Not for a second does the vision of your angelic face leave my mind. And whatever I do, I always think you are somewhere near me. My eyes suddenly moist and a lump rises in my throat. All that because poor Huzzy is alone.
This letter is from her to her husband, dated 1899 from Peterhof, and that's number 154.
My own precious darling Huzzy dear. The night was a lonely one, and each time I woke up and put my hand out, I touched a cold pillow instead of a dear warm hand. Nobody to shake and poke and bother by waking up.
There's a splendid shot of Tsarevich, naval hat from the standout.
And it's the story of the Tsar's son and heir, stricken with an incurable disease that would help pull down the dynasty.
These are the daily diaries that the Tsar and Tsarina wrote right up to the end. And this is the last page of Alexandra's diary. And she writes at the end here, played bezique with Nicholas, and at 10:30 to bed, 15 degrees.
3 hours later, Alexandra was executed. The communists allowed no memorial of any kind to the murdered family, but at this chapel in Germany, their memory was kept alive. This is Wolfsgarten, the place where Alex of Hesse, later to become Empress Alexandra of Russia, spent her childhood summers with her sister Ella.
Clever.
That's Ella.
Alex and Ella both married into the Russian imperial family, and both shared similar fates in the Russian tragedy.
This picture is rather interesting because this is actually Ella with Grand Duke Serge. And it was at their wedding that her sister Alix first saw her future husband, Nicholas, across the room. This is an extraordinary photograph, and it shows Queen Victoria surrounded by so many of her family. This was the wedding of Ernst, the brother of Alix, and there's Alix. But look, who's next to Alix? The young Nicholas Romanov. And the thing is that that was the occasion on which they got engaged.
Very much in love, the young couple had to part. With this separation, they began the very first of their hundreds of letters to each other.
Alex to Nicholas, letter number 1, May the 2nd, 1894. My own precious darling, I'm lying in bed but cannot go to sleep before I've written to you, as speak, alas, we cannot. No good night kiss and blessing.
In June 1894, after 6 weeks apart, Nicholas sailed up the Thames in the imperial yacht Polar Star. He was there to meet Alex on British soil and seek the blessing of Queen Victoria. He wrote in his diary,
Into the arms of my beloved who looked lovely and more beautiful than ever.
Alex's elder sister, Victoria, who was living in England, had rented this house at Walton-on-Thames for Nicholas and his bride-to-be. They loved their time together, so much so that the couple sent this telegram to Queen Victoria in nearby Windsor. Best love from Nicky, and we would so much like to spend only one more day here. Would arrive day after tomorrow for tea. Nicky and Alex.
Nicholas wrote in his diary, We spent the entire day together. Rode on the boat. It was a true idyll. Then we had to go to Windsor. Although we cannot complain, her grandmother was very kind and permitted us to go out without chaperones. I admit I never expected that from her.
the bliss of their engagement was to be short-lived. When Nicholas was only 26, his father, Tsar Alexander, died at Levadia Palace. Before he had even married his fiancée, with no experience or preparation, Nicholas found himself Tsar of Russia.
Nicholas's diary, 20th of October, 1894. My God, what a day. The Lord has called our adored, precious, deeply beloved papa to him. My head is spinning. I'm not prepared to be a Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling. I've no idea of even how to talk to the ministers.
Alex was sent for, their wedding hastily arranged at the Winter Palace only 1 week after the funeral.
Nicholas's diary. At 10 minutes past 12, we began the entrance into the great church, from where I returned a married man.
Alexandra wrote ominously,
Our marriage seemed to me a mere continuation of the masses for the dead, with this difference, that now I wore a white dress instead of black.
Official mourning lasted over a year. The coronation of the young emperor and his wife, now named Alexandra, did not take place until the year after that.
The Duke of Connaught represented his mother, Queen Victoria, at the coronation of Nicholas in 1896. And this is how he described the remarkable scene to his mother. If you can imagine the most magnificent pageant that you've ever seen put on the stage, coupled with the most gorgeous religious ceremony you've ever seen, then that will give you an idea of Nicky and Alex's coronation. It must have been an extraordinary event. Queen Victoria herself, after all, was hardly a stranger to pageantry. And it's interesting because from the moment of his coronation, the Tsar became God's representative on earth. The ceremony endowed him with sole responsibility for the fate of his empire. No one could take that from him. An arrangement unknown in the rest of Europe. Here you can see the Tsar wearing the imperial Russian crown.
At his coronation, Nicholas, like all czars, assumed the role of autocrat. Russia had no parliament or constitution. But the absolute power that the 28-year-old Nicholas had inherited would not protect him from the new world of the 20th century.
Serried ranks of soldiers and a sea of faces.
There was an even greater crowd waiting at Hodinka Field on the outskirts of Moscow, waiting for the traditional coronation gifts of mugs and sweetmeats. In the stampede that followed, 1,300 people were crushed to death.
The Tsar's diary, May the 18th, 1896. Today a great sin occurred. The crowd, waiting for food and mugs, put pressure on the structures and there was a horrendous crush. I must add, terribly. About 1,300 people were trampled.
An acquaintance of mine told me that he had been there when he was 12 years old, and they'd had to pull him out of the crowd by force. He'd literally had to walk on people's heads to save himself.
The tragedy was compounded when the Tsar and Tsarina attended a sumptuous ball in their honor at the French embassy the same night. They'd been recommended to go by family members who were more concerned about Russia's ally, France, than the disaster at Hodinka. This poor advice made the newly crowned couple very unpopular. It was a difficult piece of protocol, but the advice was surely wrong.
Immediately after the coronation, Nicholas and Alexandra toured Europe. First, they visited Balmoral, where Alexandra had a joyful reunion with Queen Victoria, her grandmother. But Alexandra found that in her new country, the husband she loved was worshipped as a living god. Postcards of the day depicted Nicholas as a divine figure. No other monarch in Europe was seen like that.
We had a portrait of him, and we would pray to him. We thought he was an earthly God. Jesus was in heaven, and he was God on earth. People used to say, if they were ill, if I could just touch the Tsar, if I could just put my hand on his arm or shoulder, I'd get well immediately.
At that time, an emperor, just to look at him was enough. We didn't sleep the night before in order to save a place. Finally, the Tsar drove by. Everyone shouted, hurrah! He was sitting in a carriage. I think he had a reddish beard. He went by, and we went home. That was it. The Tsar was both Tsar and God. He was everything. You could go no further. You couldn't see God, but I saw the Tsar.
All his life, Nicholas believed that, as Tsar, he had a mystical link with his people. He saw himself as their protector and savior. The Tsar was not much closer to the court in St. Petersburg. His wife, the new empress, spoke very little of her new language. She found the sophistication and scandal of Russian court life a great strain.
My mother happened to be maid of honor. She was always struck by how shy the empress was and how she was covered with red sort of blotches of redness on her face when she spoke to people.
When there was some theatrical performance, the empress, during the intervals, sat with her fan in front of her face. She literally didn't want, it would never have occurred to her to go out and talk to people. She didn't even want to be seen.
The imperial couple withdrew from the Russian court, secluding themselves at Tsarskoye Selo, their new home outside St. Petersburg. Isolated and unpopular with high society, Alexandra was sustained by her passionate love for Nicholas and their fast-developing family of beautiful girls.
3rd of November, 1895. A day I'll always remember. At exactly 9 o'clock, we heard a baby's squawk. We named her Olga. 29th of May, 1897. Second happiest day. At 10 a.m., the Lord blessed us with a little girl, Tatiana.
In 1899, their third daughter, Maria, was born, and in 1901, a fourth daughter, Anastasia. But the daughters could not succeed to the throne. In order to secure the Romanov line, the imperial family needed a son. In July 1904, the long-awaited heir to the throne, Alexei, was born. But this happy event was to have tragic consequences for the House of Romanov.
The Tsar's palace, Alexandria, was neighboring our palace of Znamenka near Peterhof, which was the outskirts of Petersburg. And the Tsar said, well, the baby is all right, fine, beautiful, there's a problem, bleeding at the navel. And at that moment, grandmother told me, I knew then that he had hemophilia. But I'm absolutely certain, said my grandmother, that the Tsar did not know.
Hemophilia threatened the life of the young heir to the Russian throne. A fall could kill him. Internal bleeding could bring terrible pain.
Hemophilia is not a problem that we worry about any longer in my family, although it certainly used to be. It was Queen Victoria, after all, who transmitted it to her son, Prince Leopold. And later, daughters of Queen Victoria passed the disease down to the Russian family and thence to the young Alexei. Not surprisingly, Alexandra, the carrier of the disease, was devastated.
Alexandra to Nicholas, September 15th, 1904. Forgive me. Those horrid tears won't keep back. Oh, what anguish it was not to let others see the knife digging in one. Thank God he is so well now.
In 1897, there was a census in Russia. The Tsar, like every other citizen, filled in the form. And when it came to describing his occupation, he wrote «Khazyain», and for his wife «Khazyaika», «Zemli Ruskoy», which means master and mistress of the Russian land. And that says a lot about the system. There were no constitutional or legal restraints on the power of the Tsar. His rule was absolute.
The autocratic system worked like this. From his study in the Winter Palace, the Tsar had all the responsibility of a full-time head of state, but was ill prepared for the task of governing and unwilling to trust others. At times, he did not even have a personal secretary. The obsolete bureaucracy made his huge task impossible. An autocrat was expected to run the country down to the tiniest detail. The Tsar would even spend time granting a divorce or a change of name to the humblest peasant.
A petition to His Most Supreme, Most Sovereign Majesty, Emperor Nicholas, Most Merciful Autocrat of all the Russias, a petition for divorce.
Sometime after our wedding, my wife started leading a debauched life. 12 years ago, she got syphilis.
My name's Finin, meaning pig, is a source of constant undeserved jokes and insults, thereby an obstacle to getting married.
So what was Russia like at the turn of the century? Agriculture was the backbone of the Tsarist economy. Peasants had been freed by Nicholas's grandfather, but they did not yet own all the land they worked. Their expectations were bitterly frustrated. Under Nicholas's father, factories had been built and cities were becoming industrialized, but workers had no control over conditions. So revolutionary theories made headway among an urban population with no rights and nowhere to express their grievances. Away from his family, Nicholas was happiest when he was with his immense armies. Previous Tsars had been remarkably successful in extending the frontiers of the empire. Now Nicholas was determined to defend his realm against internal threat. This role was very much impressed on young recruits at propaganda classes.
The lessons we had went like this. Why does Russia need an army? As 90% of our platoon were illiterate, we had to learn by heart to come out against external and internal enemies. And who are the internal enemies? The socialists. Who are the socialists? The socialists are members of the intelligentsia who don't want to work and cry down with autocracy.
Securing his empire was an enormous commitment, but Nicholas still found time to escape to his wife and children. He was very much a family man, and they were his overwhelming joy. Every year, the family took an extended cruise in the imperial yacht around the Gulf of Finland. Nicholas and Alexandra were clearly deeply in love.
Letter number 133. My Alexey, my beloved, sweet wifeykins, I love you passionately. God bless you and our babies.
Letter 155. My own sweet one, how I miss you. Those orbs, lashes, where are they to gaze into? I love you.
There were always expeditions and picnics ashore with the ship's company. Letter, Nicholas to his mother, 1906.
In the mornings, we go out in the boats with the children. How much I enjoy being able to live a little while for myself.
Another letter to his mother.
Picnics were a great success. You can judge the gaiety that prevailed by the fact that your 43-year-old son ran about and took part in games with young subalterns with as much...
Most of all, Nicholas and his family liked to spend time at their favorite palace, Livadia, on the Black Sea. It was miles away from government and dangerous revolutionaries in St. Petersburg, and the family felt that here they could meet their subjects. Nicholas felt more comfortable with religious ritual than with politics. At Easter, when all men were deemed equal, he diligently kissed each soldier from his Cossack regiments at Livadia.
Easter Monday. The main Easter greeting began at 2 p.m. in the courtyard. 920 men. It ended at 3 p.m.
The mistress of Russia was not above serving behind a stall whose proceeds went to help TB sufferers.
The Empress asked my grandmother, "What would you like?" My grandmother replied, "I should be grateful for whatever your Majesty gives me." The Empress gave her this vase and a straw fan. As a little boy, I went up to the heir to the throne with my mother. He was kneeling as he had something wrong with his legs. He wore a sailor's suit and a sailor's cap with ribbons.
The cause of Alexei's ill health, hemophilia, was a state secret. A sailor, Derevyenko, had the permanent task of watching over him. At any moment, he could fall and start bleeding through injury.
They looked after him very carefully, like a flower. They never took their eyes off him. We were frightened that we'd push him or injure him, that he'd fall, and we'd have hurt him.
Sometimes Alexei was well and insisted on playing like a normal child. Even then, Derevyenko would put down a carpet of hay to catch the Tsarevich when he fell.
Derevyenko, his name was. I even remember his name. And we took part in everything. And the boy, the Tsarevich, adored him, really loved him. Enjoyed his company, I think, more than many other friends.
The imperial household knew little about hemophilia, and Alexei was continually bruising himself. For 10 years, the sailor Derevyenko carried him when he was in pain, only to betray him cruelly and desert him when the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917. Another sailor, Nagorny, took over the task when the imperial family were interned. He was shot for that a few days before Alexei's own execution. In January 1905, the Winter Palace was the focus for an event that changed the way people thought about the Tsar. The day would become known as Bloody Sunday. A peaceful demonstration of factory workers with women and children had set out for the palace to appeal to the Tsar. Their petition begged him to grant civil rights. Nicholas had decided that it was better not to be in the palace that day. The army had no training in crowd control, panicked and opened fire, killing over 100 people. There is no film of the awful event, but this is how Soviet filmmakers reconstructed the shooting afterwards.
Nicholas's diary, 9th of January 1905. A difficult day. The troops had to fire, and in various places in the city, many were killed and injured. Lord, it is so painful and hard.
Blood was answered with blood. Shortly afterwards, Grand Duke Serge, the husband of Ella, Alexandra's sister, was assassinated by a bomb outside their palace in Moscow. The event seemed to confirm the family's mystical beliefs. 2 years earlier, a nun had predicted Serge's death.
They went to visit a very, very old nun who lived in a shabby shack in the wood. And that old nun suddenly pointed her finger at him and said, "You there with the small head, you have little to laugh because your head will go crack." She made the gesture like that. And 2 years later, a bomb was thrown at him, and practically nothing of the Grand Duke's head was ever found.
As an act of mourning, Ella took up holy orders for the rest of her life. In July 1918, on the same night that the imperial family were executed, Ella was thrown headlong down a mine shaft by Bolsheviks. As a result of Bloody Sunday, an unprecedented number of strikes paralyzed Russia. Street demonstrations struck at the heart of autocratic government.
When we arrived at our estate in the summer of 1905, we discovered peasants not only on the boundaries, but even in the park itself. And they didn't take their hats off to us anymore.
At one meeting, a speaker said, "Comrades, in our lifetime we'll live to see these things. We'll govern ourselves, there will be no owners, and we'll kick the landowners out." Another one said, "All right, but only in 500 years' time."
The Tsar was persuaded to do something. An elected assembly was summoned, and although the Tsar retained key functions like control of the army, power in Russia was no longer in the hands of one man. But the violence still did not stop. Revolutionary councils known as Soviets made a brief appearance. In Moscow and other cities, armed uprisings were ruthlessly put down by the authorities. The revolutionaries, often students, fed off the excesses of the secret police operating here in St. Petersburg. This organization, refined by Nicholas's father, infiltrated the revolutionary movement. 1 in 10 students was said to be an informer. The authorities clamped down on the unrest. Agitators were exiled to bleaker corners of the empire. Others were executed. In January 1906, almost 400 people were executed. Some around the Tsar thought he was being too lenient.
Your grandmother commented that the Tsar wasn't hard enough on revolutionaries.
She did tell me that she thought the Tsar was too lenient. Sending people to Siberia was practically giving them a passport for freedom. So grandmother, in fact, being a Montenegrin where, well, one is used to tougher ways of dealing with those who misbehave, felt that those who were murderers should suffer capital punishment. And the Tsar wouldn't do it. Not often enough, according to grandmother.
Underground magazines circulated pictures of the Tsar surrounded by a sea of skulls. The same cartoons predicted his demise. Radicals referred to the Tsar as Nicholas the Bloody. The first cracks were beginning to appear in the imperial edifice. Within the imperial family itself was a secret helping to bring down the House of Romanov, the hemophilia of Alexei, the heir to the throne. The constant threat to his life put strain on the judgment of both parents. Despairing of cures from doctors, his mother's religious fervor became extreme. Her bedroom contained 800 icons. Beyond the health of her son, little else appeared to matter. At Alexandra's instigation, a cathedral was built on the grounds at Tsarskoye Selo. There she prayed to God for help.
Tsar's Diary, November the 1st, 1905. We've got to know a man of God, Grigory.
Alexandra's prayers were answered through Grigory Rasputin. Thought to be a holy man with mysterious healing powers, he was introduced into the household to help the sick Alexei. Rasputin's strange powers probably came down to his ability to relax and reduce the level of stress in those around him. On one occasion, he appeared to heal the boy when he was ill simply by sending a telegram.
God has gazed on your tears and accepted your prayers. Be not sad, your son will live.
The Tsar's sister witnessed the effect of Rasputin's presence.
I could not believe my eyes. Rasputin had not even touched the child, but merely stood at the foot of the bed and prayed.
Soon Rasputin became a confidant of Alexandra. She relied on him when Alexei was ill.
Grandmother, for her life, has been blamed, she and her sister, for having introduced Rasputin to the Tsar. But they didn't introduce a corrupt monk. They introduced a simple peasant from beyond the mountains who spoke plain language to the powerful.
At his house in St. Petersburg, Rasputin used a direct approach in his dealings with women, too. Away from the imperial family, he embarked on wild orgies. The St. Petersburg secret police kept regular watch on his apartment and recorded this.
January the 29th, Maria Gill, the wife of a captain in the 145th Regiment, slept at Rasputin's. About 1 a.m., Rasputin brought an unknown woman to the house. She spent the night with him. Bararova, the actress, slept at Rasputin's.
Changing character, Rasputin would hurry to this house at the gates of the palace at Tsarskoye Selo when summoned by the Empress. Rumors, largely unfounded, that Rasputin was having affairs within the court, even with Alexandra, began to circulate around St. Petersburg. Importantly, Rasputin, because of his healing powers, began to have increasing influence on Alexandra, the Tsar. Few people saw Nicholas any longer as a benign Father Tsar. A confused public unaware of the seriousness of the heir's illness simply couldn't understand the importance of Rasputin to the Tsar and Tsarina. Order had been restored in the wake of 1905, but much of the frustration that had provoked the turmoil had not been properly addressed. The ground was fertile for revolution. In 1913, a group of professional revolutionaries swore an oath at Baku, sentencing the Tsar to death. Mikhail Medvedev's father was one of the authors of the proclamation. 5 years later, his father would kill the Tsar and his family.
In this proclamation, the Baku revolutionaries concluded that the Romanov dynasty should be wiped from the face of the earth.
The outbreak of the First World War and a wave of patriotism which began at the Winter Palace saved the troubled imperial family for the time being.
Nicholas's Diary, July 1914. A good day in the sense of an upsurge of spirit. Direct to the Winter Palace, signed the declaration of war. From the Malachite room we went into St. George's Hall. The entire hall sang Save Us, Lord, and Many Years. Then we went out onto the balcony in Alexander Square and bowed to the enormous mass of people.
The disastrous conduct of the war would mean that within 3 years, the divine ruler of Russia would be forced to abdicate. A revolution would begin that would alter the course of world history, with the imperial family murdered and the dynasty destroyed. In 1913, Nicholas and Alexandra celebrated 300 years of Tsarist rule by the House of Romanov. It was a triumphant anniversary. The Romanovs, it seemed, would reign in Russia forever.
How strange it is to think that after this extraordinary outpouring of support and affection for the couple, the Romanov dynasty had only 5 years to run.
All through the celebrations, a Cossack soldier carried Alexei, the heir to the throne, who was ill with hemophilia. A 4-month tour of Russia began with a tumultuous welcome for the imperial family at the river town of Kostroma, birthplace of the Romanov dynasty.
My father was weeping, like everyone around us. Everyone was so moved. He said to me, "Look, here is our Tsar. Here is our Tsarina. Here is our heir, our future."
The 4 daughters of the imperial couple were also at the celebrations, suddenly grown into beautiful young women.
As a little girl, what struck me was their wonderful big hats with ostrich feathers which fluttered as they bowed to the people. There was a giant standing there, or so it seemed to me, holding the heir to the throne, Alexei, in a sailor's uniform.
The First World War really triggered the downfall of the Romanov dynasty. In 1914, Russia had the mightiest army in the world, but it was ill prepared for the bloody battles that lay ahead.
Война. War. Krieg. Shouting. Иконы. They brought icons. Hung the icons on us. Laid them under the wheels. You can understand it. A mother, a wife, children, saying goodbye to a son or brother.
And another soldier was boarding a train for the war, also leaving behind an anxious wife.
Letter Alexandra to Nicholas, September 20th, 1914. Oh, my love, it was hard bidding you goodbye and seeing that lonely, pale face with big, sad eyes at the wagon window. My heart cried out, "Take me with you."
By 1914, Alexandra, the empress, had aged visibly from the shy young bride of 20 years earlier. The ever-present threat to her son's life, hemophilia, had broken her physically and emotionally. With the outbreak of war, the empress established a hospital at the palace at Tsarskoye Selo. Alexandra and her 2 eldest daughters, Olga and Tatiana, trained as nurses and threw themselves into the war effort.
Letters Alexandra to Nicholas, November 20th, 1914. This morning we were present at our first big amputation. Whole arm was cut off. I washed and cleaned and painted with iodine and smeared with Vaseline and bandaged all up. November 25th, 1914. During an operation, a soldier died. We all behaved well, none lost their heads, and the girlies were brave. They had never seen a death. He died in a minute. How near death always is.
It was while they were nursing at the hospital that both Olga and Tatiana fell in love with a wounded young officer, Dmitry Malamar.
They loved him very much. They thought of him as one of their own. Being in hospital brought them particularly close.
The empress wrote to the Tsar about Dmitry.
One must say what a nice son-in-law he would make for our Tatiana.
In the first 5 months of the war, the Russian army lost 1 million men, killed, wounded, taken prisoner. In 1915, a disastrous shortage of munitions led to crushing defeats.
The Germans would be shooting at us, and our artillery would just stand there in silence.
Nicholas decided to take charge. He appointed himself commander-in-chief of the Russian army and moved to the front. To boost morale, the Tsar took a risk with Alexei's health and brought him to headquarters. Soon, the heir to the throne was seen everywhere.
These are postcards from Alexei at the front to his mother. 3rd of November 1916. It's time I was sent my pay. I beseech you. And he signs it, loving and loved, your Corporal Alexei Romanov. And in December of that year, he begins to write as if he was in barracks. Idem žrać, a potom v kinematograph, which roughly translates, off noshing, and then to the flicks.
Alexei provided a distraction for the exhausted Tsar.
I got the impression that the Tsar's face was full of suffering. It was so yellow, tortured. It was as if the Tsar was suffering for all Russia.
Nicholas wrote in a letter to Alexandra,
"He brings much light into my life here." In another letter to Alexandra, "I say prayers with him every night. He says his prayers too fast. I read your letters aloud to him. He listens lying in bed and kisses your signature."
Inevitably, Alexei fell ill. The emperor of all Russia, responsible for his country's fortunes in war, was up at night tending a sick boy.
Letter, Nicholas to Alexandra. "Baby has hurt his left arm. He slept very restlessly, kept on sitting up in bed groaning, calling for you and talking to me. This went on till 4 a.m.
And in another letter,
"The little one is suffering from a strained vein in the upper part of his right leg. During the night he kept on waking and groaned in his sleep."
Desperate letters came back from Alexandra.
Take care of baby's arm. Don't let him run about in the train, so as not to knock his arms.
Finally, for his own safety, the heir to the throne was sent home.